Dawn lifted out of the Nile like a slow breath, mist curling off the reed beds and drifting across the moored boats. I stood on the embankment with a wax tablet pressed to my chest, the river's skin catching first light in shards. Drums rolled from the palace terrace. The white crown gleamed on its stand, a crescent of chalk and sunlight. The red crown, low and coiled, sat beside it like a watching serpent. Beyond the terrace, the people of both banks had already gathered, fishermen and farmers, potters and herdsmen. They had told me since childhood that the king is Horus, the falcon made flesh, the living edge between order and the hungry dark. We have a word for that order: Ma'at. It is the weight that keeps the scales true, the reed that writes the laws, the channel that guides the flood. Without it, the river forgets its banks, the winds forget their seasons, and the people forget themselves. I believed this because the elders said it, and because each year the stars returned to their places and the river rose on schedule. I believed it because my mother once held a grain of barley to the sun and said, "See how it listens." Trumpets cut the air. The new king stepped from the shade. He wore simple linen and a collar of hammered gold that threw sparks into our eyes. A priest lifted the white crown and set it upon his head, and the terrace erupted. The falcon standard dipped, the women ululated, the soldiers struck the butts of their spears until the steps trembled. A second priest carried the red crown on a cushion. The king turned, received it, and for a breath held both at once, the emblems of the two lands, north and south. The gesture was older than any temple we could name, and yet the moment felt as sharp as a freshly cut reed. My duty was to see what others did not, and fix it in words. The overseer of scribes reminded me of this, tapping my shoulder with his cane. "Do not write the noise," he whispered. "Write the pattern inside the noise." So I watched the king's eyes, how they rested not on the banners and offerings, but on the line of boats, dark on the river, like a script yet to be read. He understands the river, I thought. The river is the kingdom's throat. Grain and fish and stone move along it the way blood moves through a body. When the crowd thinned, we followed the procession to the house of Horus. The walls glowed with fresh paint. A low table held bread and beer and a thin knife. The high priest named the first kings, those who wore crowns before memory. He poured a line of water on the floor and traced with a reed the boundary of a city that was not there but would be in the mind of the gods. The king stood at the center while incense climbed the air like pale vines. When the words ended, he drew the knife across the waterline, and the priests nodded as if a door had shut. In the afternoon, we were brought the old pallet, a flat stone, dark with handling, its edges nicked where centuries of fingers had gripped it. On its face, a king smote the foe, tall as a god, with the white crown, riding his skull like a cresting wave. Two long-necked beasts, intertwined under the steady hands of keepers, rules wrapped in image. Unification is not the end of struggle. It is the discipline that keeps struggle from ripping the world. I traced the carving with my eyes and imagined the men who carved it, their wrists aching, their breaths steady. Night fell, and the city breathed out. Fires sprouted in alleys. Boats along the quay lit torches and drifted like constellations broken loose. In the palace court, the new king walked alone for a time, barefoot on cool stone, while priests prepared the meal. He must have known what the myths demanded. A god king must be tireless, pure, merciful, terrible, the source of the calendar, the weight in the judge's hand, the owner of the land, and the one who returns it to the people. He paused under a fig tree and listened to the night insects rasp. In the workers' quarter, men raised cups and sang about full bellies and safe roads. In the temple quarter, the priests sang about the first mound rising from the first waters and the falcon who landed there. In my small room, near the granary, I sharpened reed pens and laid them on a linen cloth. Words are a kind of stone, I told myself. If set well, they make a wall that wind cannot cross. If piled crooked, they collapse and invite jackals. I fell asleep and dreamed of water filling channels in perfect order. The next day, the king gave grain. He gave copper. He gave meat and cloth. He gave decrees that made old injustices bend like papyrus under a thumb. Tax boats were assigned to each bend of the river, with tall poles painted in colors so a man could count his grain from the bank. New storehouses were set on high ground with ramps for oxen. Surveyors walked the floodplain, dropping knotted cords to fix boundaries before the waters rose. The palace scribes opened jars of black ink that smelled like rain. I watched numbers bloom across fresh papyrus. On the third day, he ran. This is the trial no one forgets, the running of the Hatshepsut. Courtyards filled and rooftops bristled with faces. The king appeared in the ritual cloak, guards behind him, priests before him, and at the horn's call, he launched into the course. He ran the 4 quarters of the land, turned at the markers, touched the boundary stones. Dust leapt from his heels. The people counted aloud. Some wept at the turns. A man who cannot complete the circuit cannot carry the world. He finished the course. The elders say the run renews the bond between king and ground, that each stride wakes the spirits asleep in the soil. I saw farmers rub dust from the track into their palms as if it were seed. I saw a blind singer tilt his head to catch the rhythm of the footfalls and smile. Even the hawks circled lower, as if called by an old agreement. 3 days after the coronation, the king visited the tombs of his ancestors. We went with him into stone that breathed cold. Oil lamps revealed walls burning with ochre and malachite. On those walls, the dead kings walked in procession toward a doorway painted with stars. Their feet never touched the ground. They were always stepping and always arriving. The steward pointed out the scenes, the weighing of the heart, the offering of loaves, the embrace of the goddess whose hair falls like the night. The king stood very still, as if listening. When we came out, the sun was low and red on the river. A woman from the crowd held up her child and called that the flood had been kind last year. The king took the child in his arms and lifted him high so the people could see the curve of a future. Later, behind the audience hall, I found him speaking with a builder over a plan for a temple that would bind the city and the sky with a single axis. The builder spoke of foundations and quarries and the way water could be used to level stone. The king listened and asked how long the road would take. It was then I understood the secret my elders had wrapped in proverbs and ceremony. We call the king divine, not because we refuse to see his human face, but because we insist that he carry more than any human shape can bear. He is oath and harvest and flood and verdict. He is the living answer to the terror that the world might be meaningless. So we chain meaning to his body and walk beside him with cords and measures, grain tallies and hymns, so his steps are straight and his shadow is long enough to shade our fears. At week's end, as birds folded into the reeds and the west turned to bronze, the king walked the boundary of the city. Priests carried jars, scribes carried pallets, soldiers carried nothing at all. The people watched from roofs and doorways. At each quarter point, the high priest poured water, and the king cut the line with the thin knife from the first day. When he returned to the starting place, the priest lifted the empty jar and declared that the city was sealed in the sight of the gods. The crowd answered with a roar that rolled along the rooftops. I wrote it as a single line, "Keep." It sounded like a prayer and a command at once. Keep the channels, keep the peace, keep the weights honest, the measures true, the hearts lighter than the feather. The drums answered, far off, steady as a heartbeat. I closed my tablet and understood that the birth of a god-king is not a miracle that falls from the sky. It is a discipline we choose each morning when we bind ourselves to Ma'at and to one another, and say to the river, to the sun, to the boundless dark at the edges of the fields, keep. Chapter 2. Machines for Eternity. At first light, the quarry woke before the birds. Hammers the size of fists struck in a slow heartbeat that rolled through the cliff like thunder turned inward. I stood above the cut with dust on my tongue and watched men chip a path around a sleeping block, their copper edges flashing as if they were shaving the day from stone. A foreman wet the ground with jars of water. When the sled bit into the damp sand, it slid forward with a whisper, as if the earth had agreed to help. The men leaned as one body, and the block moved, heavy as a promise. They said once there were only mastabas, low benches for the great dead. Then a mind climbed. It is written in the old registers that a man named Imhotep stacked benches into a stair and told the king to step up to the sky. He did not argue with the gods. He argued with gravity. The story says he pressed his ear to stone and listened to how it wanted to stand. Whether that is true, I cannot say, but I have walked the terraces of that first step pyramid at Saqqara and felt how it coils the desert into a ladder. Wind skates over its edges and dives into its courts, a hiss like breath through a flute. In the shadow of those steps, the living learn the shape of ascent. Our king wanted more than a ladder. He wanted a horizon that could not be mistaken. To make such a thing, you must gather a city that can walk and sing and eat and measure while its hands lift mountains. We rode north along the river to the labor village that swelled beside the building ground. The smell of yeast and straw met us before the gate. Bakers slid long loaves into mouths of clay that glowed with banked coals. Cattle were led to butchers who spoke to them softly as the knife kissed the hide. Children carried baskets of onions and jars of beer balanced on their heads. The scribe who guided me tapped his board. Write this. He wanted the names and the rations, the rhythm of bread, beer, dried fish, garlic. The pyramid would not rise without this music. Do not write them as shadows, the steward told me. Write them as men and women called by name. So I learned the crews by their banners, the drunkards of the king, who sang loudest at dusk, the enduring gang, who joked that they were harder than stone, the West Slope larks, lean and quick, who turned sleds at the markers with a dancer's grace. They did not sleep in chains. They slept in rows of houses, the color of baked milk, with courtyards where mothers washed dust from boys' hair and old men cooled their feet in jars turned to basins. There were doctors with boxes of needles and herbs, priests with jars of oil, carpenters who could bend cedar like a bow, and sailmakers whose cloth grabbed the wind as a hawk grabs rabbits. Behind the village, beyond the ovens and pens, was the great flat place cleared for the base. It did not look like a foundation. It looked like a map. Scribes laid out grids with knotted cords, marked squares with red ochre, and wrote numbers that climbed like steps. The surveyor raised a plumb line and waited until the string stilled, then set a peg. Another man sighted along a straight edge as the astronomer muttered the names of stars that never drown in the west, the imperishables. On a night before the first courses, the king himself came with the high priest for the stretching of the cord. They pulled a cord tight between two stakes, as if tuning an instrument, and with the merkit the priest read the line of the north. When they drove the first pegs, the sky was watching. Stone came as a tide. From the quarry, men pried blocks with copper and wood. Where the cliff was cruel, they cracked it with fire and prayer, heating and dousing so the rock sighed and gave up a face. Round, pounding stones of hard black rock rattled like teeth. Sleds hissed on wet sand. At the foot of the slope, oxen leaned until their legs quivered, then were led away and rubbed with oil and fed something sweet. A whistle, a chant, a heave. The block rose. The ramp took it. The earth itself became a tool, layered and beaten until it remembered the feet that climbed it. There are many ways to persuade a block to climb. Along one face, the builders raised a ramp broad as a road, packed with rubble and clay and salted with water to bind the dust. On another face, they built smaller ramps that turned back upon themselves, patient snakes that hugged the stone. On the upper courses, where the wind grows loud, men built platforms of wood and used levers so simple a boy could understand them, and so strong a man could bless them. A lever is a humble god. It asks only a place to stand and a shoulder to lean. I wrote that in the margin, and the overseer smiled. When the course was set, masons kissed the joint with copper chisels and thin wedges of gypsum plaster that hid between stones like breath between lips. I watched a master mason stand with his cheek to the face and run his open hand along it, as if smoothing a sick child's hair. He tapped, he listened, he nodded once and raised his tool. Dust rose in a fine cloud that smelled faintly of rain. Another crew came with wooden sledges and slid the next block into the tightness left for it, like a seat saved at a crowded feast. Men sang, so they pulled together. The song told them when to lean, when to rest, when to joke with the gods. At dusk, I walked to the boat pits, long shadowed trenches beside the building ground. Carpenters were fitting planks of cedar with tenons and pegs. The smell took me across deserts in a breath. A captain told me the wood came from a coast where the mountains fall into the sea and the waves speak a different tongue. He ran his fingers along a curve of hull and said the king would sail this vessel when he left the mouth of the west and rose with the sun. He said it, as one says, the way to market, with the assurance of a map memorized since childhood. The men sanding the planks wore the dust of another land on their arms. The pit would be covered and sealed, a ship folded into the ground like a promise kept for a journey already charted. In the dark, the astronomer brought me to the half-built passages. We lay on our backs in the cool and looked into the black square of a shaft that rose through the heart of the work. He lit a lamp once and put it out, so our eyes would remember the sky. In time, a bead of light trembled in the opening, a cold drop of star. He named it, and then another, the ones that never sleep. The shaft pointed not to a day, but to forever. Through that vein, the soul that his breath would rise and learn to be light. He spoke of the king's bar, the winged thing that travels, and the car, the strength that eats and drink, and how both must be nourished and guided. Do not write this as sorcery, he told me. Write it as the calendar written in stone. I understood. In a kingdom where the river governs, the greatest boast is to make time obedient. There were failures. There were always failures. One morning a face slipped, and the road of the ramp tore away, and dust swallowed men who had eaten with us the night before. The foreman stood with hands open and said their names. Copper edges were driven into the mess and turned until the blocks came apart again. The tomb priest sprinkled milk. The doctors came and bound the living. That night, the singers did not sing. The next day, the ramp was rebuilt, and the chant rose again, slower, lower, with a thread of grief braided into the rope of sound. The overseer said, "Write that the king paid the families from his own stores. It would be remembered that way." The years learned the shape of the work. Rain seasons softened the ramps and made them stink of wet clay. Dry seasons baked them hard as fired pots. Babies were born in the village and named for courses of stone. Boys knotted cords around their foreheads and pretended to be surveyors. Girls practiced setting a bowl level with drops of water. The masons grew old, and their hands forgot how to be still. They could not pass a wall anywhere in the city without smoothing it for the pleasure of it. I saw a mason on a holy day stand in the street and admire the way sunlight ran along the edge of a doorway like a blade being tested. When the siding stones came, white and fine as moonlight, the pyramid began to refuse the desert. Light gathered on its faces and walked up them as the day turned. At sunrise, the east face burst into flame. By noon, the four faces wore an even gleam, like the pelt of a tame lion. At dusk, the west face drank the last light as if keeping it for the next morning. People came from far villages and stood a long time without speaking. In the evening, I heard the old explaining to the young why sharpness is a kind of mercy. A clean edge teaches the wind to go around rather than to gnaw. The day of the Pyramidion came like a festival and a fast at once. The capstone slept under a linen tent for weeks, while goldsmiths hammered thin skin of electrum until it lay smooth as water. The king came in a simple robe. The priests carried the feather of Maat, a scale, a palm rib for measuring, jars of sweet oil. Crews along the ramps stood in two lines facing each other, their faces streaked with dust and oil, their mouths shining with beer. The carpenters worked the sled and levers. The stone rose. The village held its breath until sound seemed to stop. Then the cap gently kissed the summit, and every throat opened. The sun leapt in the metal and ran out across the desert, a bright shout thrown to the edges of the world. That night, the astronomer took me once more to the passages. We were alone. The lamps were set far apart, islands of light. He asked me to put my palm on the cool wall and feel the faint tremor that lived in the stone after great weight has shifted and come to rest. That is what we have made, he said, a resting. The king's body will lie here and learn to stop being heavy. His name will be recited and fattened with offerings. His face will meet the gods with a jaw washed in the waters of the sky. But do not forget what else the pyramid holds. It holds a story about us, how we learned to make a shape strong enough to carry hope past the horizon. In the weeks after, the crews dismantled the ramps and smoothed the ground as if a tide had gone out. The village shrank. Men went home with new scars and better tools. Bakers returned to humbler ovens. But on feast days, people still walked to the open court and sat under the gaze of the white faces. They pointed to the line where the pyramid meets the sky and told children to memorize it, the way one memorizes a prayer. The boat pits were sealed, the cedar asleep like a rolled map. In the temple below the east face, priests lit dawn fires and woke the names. At noon, a shadow fell like a blade on the courtyard marker, and time admitted it had been taught. I wrote my last lines for the chapter of building and handed the tablet to the steward. He traced the words and lifted his eyes to the bright mountain. "We do not only bury the king here," he said. "We bury chaos for a while. Then we will build again." He was right. The work was never simply a monument to a man. It was a machine for eternity, swallowing fear and breathing order, binding the river to the sky with a road of stone that even the wind must respect. And as I walked back through the evening bread smell and the soft clatter of pottery, I understood that we had not merely raised a pyramid. We had taught the desert to tell time and the people to believe that tomorrow belongs to the living. Chapter 3. When Gods Break the Rules. Perfume rose from the stone like memory. On the terraces of the northern cliffs, the temple faced the morning with steps as wide as the sky, each level planted with trees whose leaves shivered in a breeze from the river. Between the pillars, a relief showed slender ships riding a sea of carved lines, their sails swollen with a wind that smelled of resin and cinnamon. I stood among priests and traders and soldiers as women ground incense into powder bright as sunset. They called it the gift of Punt, a place that lives in the mouth when you say it, soft and round, as if the sea were teaching you to speak. Our king was a woman whose voice could still a court. She did not shrink to fit the throne. She made the throne fit her. At dawn, she took the blue crown and the crook and the flail and stood beneath banners that snapped like tame lightning. Scribes wrote her names twice, once as daughter of kings and once as chosen by the god. On the walls, she was carved in the embrace of a god who leaned close to whisper the future. In the colonnades, her divine birth unrolled like a river of images, midwives smiling, gods nodding, every gesture calculated to bind doubt into silence. I learned the temple's lines with my feet. On the lowest terrace, arches of shade where traders set their baskets and told the prices of far coasts. On the middle terrace, a breath of cool air that smelled of stone and water. On the highest terrace, the shrine where only certain words could be said and certain silences kept. Between the pylons, the Queen's engineers had fitted obelisks of red granite so tall that hawks seemed to test themselves against their tips. Men had brought them down the Nile on barges that made the river wider by the audacity of their passing. To raise a needle of stone and fix sunlight to its point is another way to write that Ma'at holds. The priests said she fed the land with trade. I saw it with my eyes. Ships came up with ebony and ivory and gold rings coiled like snakes. They brought trees whose roots still remembered another soil, planted them in beds that had never seen such perfumes, and watched them live. I tasted a sweet oil on my tongue and felt it open hidden doors in the head. In the galleries, the scribes tallied bundles while singers poured out hymns like honey. Stonecutters set her cartouches deep, so wind could not steal them. The people, who know the texture of order by touch, moved through her city with an ease I had not felt since the pyramid days. It was not war that fattened the granaries that year. It was the geometry of promise fulfilled. Yet even a clear morning carries the shadow of evening. In corners where lamps burned low, men carved a boy's name on training stele. In drill yards, soldiers raised dust and grumbled that a crown has only one head and it should be a man's. The queen kept the army close and the temples closer. She wrapped herself in words forged by priests, and the priests wrapped themselves in her favor. Her co-ruler grew taller, learned to hold the bow, learned to call the chariot's horses by their proper names, when he finally wore the cobra on his brow alone. Some chisels went to work in galleries where footsteps echoed and guards looked away. Faces were smoothed from scenes, cartouches turned to empty ovals. I ran my fingers along the blankness and felt how silence can be sharpened to a blade. The new king took the old roads of war that had grown dusty. Trumpets woke the garrisons. On the northern frontier, he broke the stiff pride of cities that had forgotten to keep their tribute honest. On the stone walls at the great temple, he carved rivers of captives and heaps of copper daggers given in surrender. The god loved him, he said, and the god proved it by letting him stand on the necks of enemies. Priests blessed the spears and poured beer on the thresholds. There is a way a land grows loud when the king hunts glory, and I heard it again. But something had shifted in me since the terraces. I had seen a crown steady the world with ships and spices, with streets where women walked at dusk without fear, with workers whose hands smelled of cedar instead of blood. I knew now there is more than one way to make Mayat visible. Years rolled, and then a different wind blew over the river. The new king of another time was young and serious. He wore a thin face that watched the sky more than it watched men. He took a name that praised the sun's disk and refused the old syllables that had guarded the gates for centuries. He did not move the gods to the back of the procession. He moved them out of the city. At first it felt like a fashion, like a change of mourning length or the tilt of a crown. The hymns emptied of names and filled with light. Priests of Amun found their doors barred and their incomes measured by new hands. Workers who carved gods were told to carve a circle, and where rays touched the earth, to carve little hands, giving life to the nostrils of the king and his queen. On the temple walls, the lines grew long and simple, bodies softened and bellies rounded. Daughters stood in the sun with shaved heads and heavy earrings. Laughter reached into scenes that had never laughed. The king kissed his wife in relief, and the court learned to look away. Then stones moved. A new city was sketched on fresh ground where cliffs bent like folded arms. The name meant horizon of the sun. Camps arrived, then workshops, then palaces spread like the ribs of a fan. Streets were drawn with a string and a reed, straight as school lessons. In the morning, the sun stepped through the gateway and the courtyards spilled gold. The king stood on a balcony and poured offerings of wine that bled dark into the dust. He called the light his father and called himself only the sun. He spoke of truth and the sweetness of air and how the sun sees all heads and no head can hide. Some of this was beautiful. I will not lie. There were moments when the city seemed to ring like a tuned bowl, and everyone inside drank the same sound. I saw the royal sculptor carry a face from his shop that looked as if the stone had been caught thinking. I saw sunrooms where thin curtains floated, and girls chased each other with bowls of grapes. I saw the king in a chariot with reins tied around his waist, letting the horses pull him into laughter. Here the god was a circle and a warmth, and you could feel it on your skin. But while the circle blessed the balconies, letters piled up in the storehouses. Clay tablets from northern princes asking for troops and promising loyalty if only someone would answer before the harvest failed. Border forts reported that messengers were turned twice at the temple gates. Tax boats arrived and were told to leave their grain at wharves watched by men from the palace, not the old priests. The old gods do not starve when their offerings are stolen. The poor do. I walked to the old city, where the great temple once inhaled and exhaled 10,000 prayers at dawn. The pylons were scabbed with hammer marks. In the courts that had smelt of lotus and kine fat, sun painted the floors with too much honesty. Some images had been spared by accident, or by mercy, or by the habit of hands that could not bring themselves to blaspheme the muscles they had sculpted all their lives. In one chapel, a ram god stared at me from behind a curtain of dust, his paint still bright where a cobweb had protected it. The keeper lifted his shoulders. "Orders are orders," he said. "The dust does not ask questions." And for a moment, I envied him. In the new city, where elms and palms had begun to pretend they were native, the king wrote hymns that melted the throat when sung. He walked bareheaded, the rays blessing his skull. He made gardens where the water shone like a cut mirror. He gave the poor bread. In gates he himself opened. He was generous as a morning and relentless as noon. He had learned a lesson truer than he knew. Light reveals. So it revealed the emptiness in the storehouse once the gold of the temples had been melted and weighed. It revealed soldiers whose belts hung 2 holes tighter. It revealed ambassadors whose smiles were all teeth. It revealed a queen who carried more of the crown than her husband remembered to carry, and daughters who learned the weight of ceremony too young. It revealed a court that feasted on change, as if change were a fruit that never rots. When the king died, the city kept its shape for a few more seasons, the way a tent keeps its shape for a breath after the pole is pulled. Then the rope slackened. The circles slid down the wall at sunset and did not rise inside the hearts that had been told it alone would be enough. The child who wore the crown changed his name so it would no longer praise the disk, but the hidden lord of the old city. He moved the court back to the place where pylons throw long shadows and sphinxes remember to face the road. We traveled with him. The processions smelled of the old smoke. The broken faces were carved again with features, though no chisel can ever put back what zealotry has ground away. The high priests walked with measured steps. Boys swept the thresholds with reeds dipped in milk. The music was the music of return, harps making the air warm, drums praising feet. In proclamations, the child king was said to have restored the world, to have lifted abandoned altars and pulled weeds from sacred courts, to have taught bread and beer their names again. He walked beside guardians who watched the horizon of the throne as much as the horizon of the land. I stood in the great hall and watched the old gods take back their rooms. I told myself I was witnessing Ma'at, reclaiming her house from a fashion that had ruined itself with light. But the part of me that had felt the new city ring like a bowl would not be silent. It reminded me that the heretic had also wanted order, a simpler order than the thicket of priests and fees and old oaths. He had wanted a single warmth and a single gaze. He had simply forgotten that a single gaze cannot see the back of its own head. A circle gives everything but counsel. In time, the child king slept in a tomb so full of small suns that for a moment the court believed fortune had forgiven the experiment. Then generals who understood the weight of spears and clerks who owned the habits of granaries took the pen and wrote their names larger. They punished enemies as if erasing past mistakes could be done with whips. The new rules looked like old rules with the dust shaken off. The temples found their balance, their offerings fat again, their doors at dawn swinging on hinges that knew the tune. On a cool night, I went back to the terraces of the woman who made trade a sacrament. The trees still breathed, though some had died and been replaced, and so lineage said one thing while bark said another. The obelisks wore their patient fire. The reliefs of ships still crossed a stone sea that never roughens. I placed my palm on a panel where her name had once been, chiseled away and later recut by hands that knew the crime was not only against a person, but against a promise. The stone felt warm to the touch, though I knew it was only the day leaving. We say the pharaoh is a god on earth. When a god upholds Mayat, the world loosens its jaw and eats well. When a god breaks the rules, the world does not end at once. It shudders. It tries to keep going on yesterday's momentum. Men adjust their belts. Priests speak louder. Scribes work later. Mothers count grain twice. Then the shudder reaches the far rooms and the calendars slip on their pegs. What saves us is not thunder, but the daily craft of mending. A boy king changing a name. A mason relining a doorway. A priest sweeping the court before dawn, pushing dust that does not ask questions toward the edge where wind will take it. I wrote this, and I wrote something else beneath it, in a smaller hand, a note to myself I never meant to read aloud. Every heresy is a mirror. If you hate what you see, ask which part of you wants what he wanted. Then decide how to pay for it without burning the house. I closed my tablet and felt the night change as the river turned in its sleep. Somewhere on the edge of the fields, a jackal called and another answered. And between them lay the city, its gods old and new, its doors newly swept, its people ready to wake and bind the day to the order we insist upon, even knowing how easily it slips. Chapter 4: War, Twilight, and Immortality. The dust before Kadesh lifted like a veil and then refused to fall. I tasted grit and horse sweat and the iron tang that hangs over ranks when men hold their breath at the same time. The king's chariot wheels were as tall as my chest, spokes humming, leather reins creaking against his fists. Ramesses, beloved of falcon gods, the sun drawn on his brow, stood in the basket with feet planted wide, the bow already strung. Ahead lay the river bent like an elbow, and beyond it, the walls of Kadesh that had taunted every map in the royal house. Somewhere in that haze were Hittite chariots, 3 men to a car, heavy as crocodiles, fast as bad news. Messengers had come running with stories that soothed the ear. The enemy had fled, the scouts said. The road was open. The king took the bait because kings are also men. The camp was pitched light, the divisions behind still dragging their feet through sand hot enough to shape clay. Then the ground shook. Out of the dust poured chariots that seemed to have been woven from the noise itself. They smashed the forward line and cut through the camp like a plow. Tents flew. The royal cooks died where they stood. I saw a captain try to plant a standard in ground that had turned to water. The king did not retreat. He gathered the reins, lashed the team, leaned into the bow, and drove straight at the hole the enemy had torn through the middle of us. Horses foamed, the axles screamed. He loosed arrows until his forearm bled, and then took the spear and made the chariot itself into a word the enemy could not misread. Bodyguards who had never failed him failed to catch his dust. The scribe in me remembered to count breaths between charges, because that is how you know if a man still owns the day. He did. Barely by sundown, the enemy had spent the force of surprise, and the rest of our troops had found us, faces streaked with road and fear. The river held its straight face and moved on. Night came in swinging doors. In that pause, under lamps turned low, the scribes began their true work. They wrote hymns to bravery, while the grooms stitched torn harness and surgeons stitched torn men. They wrote the king taller than memory, and the enemy smaller than a rumor. They pounded bronze into words that would be hung on temple walls and copied onto papyri that would survive the rot of granaries and the rodents' patient teeth. They took a day that had very nearly become a funeral and made it into a crown. Months later, the king made a different choice. Steel had shown its price. He sent envoys north with palms open. The king of Hatti met him in the middle of the sand, and they made a peace that outlived both their throats. 2 copies were carved. 2 languages were trusted. 2 gods' lists were invoked like a chain thrown over a storm. I saw the treaty pressed into clay and into stone, and into the habits of men who preferred tribute that arrived on boats to glory that arrived on biers. We had learned that Ma'at is kept not only by chariots, but by promises that know how to stand. Our borders stretched and shrank like a chest breathing. We kept the roads swept, the wells marked, the forts stocked, the tolls fair enough to keep caravans from turning around. We carved walls where the king struck and where the king forgave. The truth lived somewhere between images, and the kingdom lived on the strength of both. Then the light shifted. Storms arrived from directions that maps call edges. Men with hair like sea foam and shields rimmed with foreign thunder ran at our coasts. Some called them sea peoples because a single name keeps the throat from tripping. Farmers came to the city with stories of harvests taken by soldiers who spoke our tongue and wore our king's falcon, but looked at empty granaries and thought of their children first. At Deir el-Medina, the workmen who cut tombs for the mighty stacked their tools and folded their arms when rations failed 3 weeks in a row. "A strike," said the overseer, and then he said it again, more quietly, as if learning a new word. Kings rose and laid down. Ramesses ceased to be a man and became a budget, a monument program, a style of relief. Priests counted more than generals some years and less in others. At times, Libyan chiefs wore our crowns and asked our gods to speak in accents they did not pretend to hide. Nubian kings came north and reminded us that our southern cradle could be a throne. Assyrian lines cut the map the way a hard stylus cuts damp clay. Then the Persian satraps brought a tidy cruelty that kept accounts neat and souls smudged. Each time I wrote what could be written and kept in my head what would not survive a court recitation. Do not think the gods were silent. They were never more talkative. Temples multiplied, hymns fattened with titles. Processions grew longer, as if the road itself could hold back the tide. I watched the Book of the Dead grow more crowded, more spells for more precise dangers, as if words could be stacked like sandbags against a flood. Perhaps they can. Perhaps they did for a time. The Nile had its stubborn seasons, and so did we. When the Macedonian hawk swept in from the horizon, He came like a man who had mistaken the world for a battlefield and won. He did not bother to be cruel. He was busy being inevitable. In his shadow, new rulers planted themselves like cypresses along the river's bend. They took our crowns and our gods and taught them Greek vowels. A new family carved itself into our story and, to their credit, learned quickly that Egypt does not love governors. It loves kings who remember they are gods while pretending they are clerks. Between the library's lamps and the lighthouse's beam, a new city trained the sea to bow, and money hummed through its markets like bees through clover. At the end of that line stood a woman who had been taught since childhood to make her voice a key. Cleopatra read in several tongues and learned to make each one her own mirror. She did not dress as anyone else asked her to dress. She wore what the room needed. In the old temples, she spoke the words as if they had been carved on the inside of her mouth. In the quick halls of the new city, she turned debate to music and made men think they were the soloists. She fed the city when the river sulked and counted ships at dusk like a broker. She knew the old dream by heart. A pharaoh is a god who feeds the world and is fed by it. She chose allies in Rome because the world had collapsed into a fist, and the fist lived there. With one Roman, she made a son and a statement. With another, she tried to make a border for a future that would let Egypt remain more than a section in somebody else's account book. She bet on charm and on the old magic of showing a man his own best self reflected in your calm. Sometimes that magic works. Sometimes the mirror breaks and you are left holding bright but useless shards. The night we learned of the sea fight at Actium, the harbor held its breath. It was not the numbers alone that hurt. It was the knowledge that the opposite shore had the patience to turn victories into laws. The new Roman was a gardener of empire, slow, careful, pruning what he could not uproot. When our queen realized that the story would be written without her or about her, she refused to be written as a trophy. The manner of her leaving matters to painters more than to priests. What matters is that when the guards pried open the inner room, the air was sweet with a finality no tax can smell like. The Romans entered the temple and counted statues. They bowed to the gods as conquerors bow, with hands that weigh first and bless second. So the crown passed into a museum of titles, and the city learned to recite other names at dawn. You might think Ma'at failed then. You would be both right and wrong. The scales tipped and did not right themselves within the span of one man's hair turning grey. But the habit of order does not only live on a brow, it lives in the hands of a surveyor, tying his cord to a peg and waiting for the string to be still. It lives in a midwife measuring the breath between a child's first cries. It lives in a mason's palm, reading a wall for patience. The gods learned new alphabets. The river kept its own. In the years that followed, I walked the old places, guided by keepers whose fathers had taught them the soft steps for quiet doors. In the Valley of the Kings, the air was cool as a hand on a fevered brow. Lamps licked color from walls crowded with serpents and boats and spells that fold around a soul like linen. In one small room, the gold mask watched from a bed of shadow. The face was a grammar of youth, the blue stripes of the headdress a promise that still knows how to promise. I stood with my breath shallow, as if too much oxygen might tarnish a god. Across from the mask, a scene told the old truth with the calm of an accountant. A scale. On one pan, a heart. On the other, a feather. A god with the head of a bird, read the line. A scribe with the head of an ibis wrote what could not be appealed. A patient monster waited, jaws polite. The scene is either a threat or a kindness, depending on the life you have lived. I traced the feather with my eyes and wondered how it could be both so light and so heavy. I thought of kings who ran the Hatshepsut until their knees forgot fear, and of kings who ran only from their own shadows and dragged everyone into the chase. I thought of treaties carved deep enough to outlast enemies, and of decrees whispered into rooms so small that even echoes felt crowded. I thought of a woman who turned trade into theology, and another who tried to turn sunlight into law. I thought of a boy sealed in rooms full of miniature suns because his elders wanted the world to forgive them for believing too much in themselves. We called our rulers gods on earth, not to flatter them, though we are not immune to that warm disease, but to put a name to the choke point where chaos meets a body. Sometimes the body resisted, sometimes it conducted, sometimes it invited the flood in and asked us to drink with it. Always we were there beside the throne with cords and calendars and loaves and jars and songs, trying to teach power to keep a rhythm that would let children sleep. On my last night in the West Bank, the desert was a low drum and the river a slow bow across a string. I sat in the mouth of a tomb and watched the lantern light crawl the painted stars. Behind me, in other rooms, lay kings who had once been the most urgent problem on the earth. Now, they were a gentleness that smelled of oil and dust. I wrote a last line in the book I had been keeping since the first coronation I witnessed as a frightened apprentice. Keep. The word had not changed, though the hands that wrote it had learned new tremors. Keep the weights honest. Keep the doors swept. Keep the flood in love with its banks. Keep the feather safe from hands that would press on it. Keep the stories that make boys stand taller, and the receipts that make taxes fair, and the maps that tell boats where the sand shifts. Keep the memory that order is not a gift, but a craft, not a miracle, but a maintenance. The gods may walk, or they may ride, or they may sleep under gold. The river will turn in the dark and pretend it has always known the way. What remains to us is the discipline to step with it, to honor Ma'at without asking her to do more than a feather can, and to look at the mask and see not death's jewelry, but the face of an idea that refuses to die. If this journey through crowns and sand sparked something in you, press like so the story reaches more curious minds. Tell me in the comments which moment hit you hardest and why. Was it the first coronation, the pyramid rising like a sunrise, the heresy that tried to rewrite the heavens, or the peace carved after Kadesh? I read every comment. Subscribe to Echoes of History and ring the bell so you never miss a chapter. New deep dives are coming. Vote in the community tab to choose the next expedition. Your voice steers where we dig. If you want more right now, continue the saga with our Vikings documentary or step back to the rise and fall of the Mongol Empire. Both are waiting for you at the end of this video. One last question to carry with you tonight. Which ruler best guarded Ma'at in your eyes? Hatshepsut with ships and trade, Ramesses with steel and treaty, the heretic who chased the sun, or Cleopatra balancing empires? Leave your answer and your reason below. Thank you for watching and for keeping history alive with your attention. I am grateful you were here. Until the next expedition, keep the roads swept, keep the scales honest, and keep the stories